Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to view R.I.P.D 2 Rise of the Damned. So, for those of you that have gone on and already seen the Ryan Reynolds, Jeff Bridges R.I.P.D movie, we now have a movie that is actually a prequel to that. This says sequel, but it's actually a prequel film. So, for those of you that liked the Jeff Bridges character, Roy Cephas, we are going on and giving you the origin of that character within this film. Having Roy getting tied with a partner named Gene, who likes to take down deados with a sword instead of a gun, and come to find out this character will have some historical value. And so I was like, okay, like that was like really interesting how we eventually got to find out who this person really was. But so we have us looking at these two films, and I think I would immediately go on and compare these movies to another supernatural movie franchise called Ghost Rider. Ghost Rider, of course, both of the movies had Johnny Blaze, had Nicolas Cage as to be within those both movies, but the first Ghost Rider, of course, had this like more like bigger budget. It was to go on and like be this massive story and so on and so forth, where its sequel is to go on and do something visually drastically different. It is to try to go in a much more darker direction, and at the end of the day, the only real tie from the first movie to the second is to have Nicolas Cage in there, because the other Ghost Rider 2 is to even try to reinvent the whole origin story of the character. So, with that said, R.I.P.D 2 goes into a visually different direction than its original film. But I guess you would also just have to state that there is quite a bit of time between Roy's time and then when Roy is going to be teaming up with Ryan Reynolds' character. So I guess you can oddly also state that that of course Roy is also going to age. Roy is also drastically going to age, even though he's already dead. Doesn't quite make any sense, but hey, like, I guess we just have to kind of suspend disbelief here. But there is actually, in this movie, there is some similarities to R.I.P.D., but it's very, like, it's very thin. We are to also go into this movie, and I gotta state that there is some time where this movie does stretch a lot. I feel like there is moments where, like, I was like, man, it would be cool if we would just kind of go on and do some like side missions, kind of like in the original R.I.P.D movie, where Bridges and Reynolds go off to go to one case, so that way Ryan can know like how unexperienced he really is, and then go on and have them further go into the real case that they should be solving. This movie doesn't go on and do that. Like, it just really is to like be so focused, and is to kind of go on and state like, well, hey, like, what Roy wants to go on and do, they're going to just needs to think that he needs to do. We're going to have Gene, who's going to somehow connect that to what they really need to do here. And come to find out, Roy and Gene's like mission is somehow all connected because it's very convenient. So with that said, R.I.P.D. 2 is an interesting film, but like I would not go on and like go and come in here with really high hopes. I would just say that this movie is barely okay. It's a barely okay film. I would much rather state that it's like a in between okay and bad. So like it's one of those where it's like a consolation prize of just like, well, it's an interesting film. Um, like I was entertained by it, even though there were some points where I'm like, man, this movie is dragging at certain points. I was like, man, there could be quite a bit of scenes that could have been edited out. Why is this movie an hour and 42 minutes? That seems very long. Um, and plus, also, like, we really have to play even more so in this movie than in the others with the uh the Roy and Mabel thing. And what I mean by that is some people are to go on and see um, Roy as a different person, and that person ends up being a female. And so they kind of play up with that a lot more, I feel, in this movie than they do in the other R.I.P.D. film. And so that to me was like, okay, I guess that makes sense, but like that also just kind of tells me that like this story like overall didn't have enough action in it. Like I wish that this movie had more action. Like I wish that we could have gone on and really seen a lot more deados in this movie, um, because it starts to kind of lose like its like I want to see more supernatural stuff. I want to see what we all came here for, which we saw in the first movie. So with that said, so yeah, so go on and see this movie if you kind of want to see like a prequel film, or you just liked R.I.P.D. anyways, and so you want to check this out. If you've never even gone on and seen R.I.P.D., then this sequel is, or this sequel is to actually be a prequel anyways, so you can check this out and then go on and still watch R.I.P.D. anyways. So with that said, this movie is going to at some point be available soon, I think, to be straight to be released as a DVD and Blu-ray thing on November 15th. I, of course, was to go on and be able to find an app that I dare in fact could watch this already for free. And so I will go on and list off apps that you can dare in fact be able to see RIPD 2 for free. So I'll give you that option because it's already easily available. So with that said, I'm going to go on and give you an app called Doxy, Doxcy. You can go and see RIPD 2 for absolutely free. Letting everybody know though, you might go on and at some point you could either put in the words RIPD, or you might have to put the periods in between the RIPD, and it might actually pop up that way. If you're going on and kind of searching and like, wait a minute, this doesn't come up, you would have to go on and search RIPD with the periods in between, and then it comes up. So next off, Play UHD. Play UHD will be able to get you to see RIPD 2 as well as a number of other films. If at some point RIPD 2 is even not on the app, you can in fact watch a number of premium access stuff for absolutely free. And so you can go on and see a lot of stuff that you wouldn't be able to, especially if you would have to forcibly need to go into certain specific apps to be able to see this kind of stuff. The next two apps, they lessen in degree of how like well they could be found, but maybe you'll be able to find them anyways. So next app would be 123 Movies. I think the logo that I end up watching 123 Movies in has the word hub on it. and it's in like gold. So hopefully people can kind of thumb through and find the right 123 movies, because there's some 123 movies where it's hard to access the servers, or you can't access the content. So like eventually you'll go on and find a 123 movies that actually does legitimately work. And the next, Yes Movies. Yes Movies, there is some goofy versions of Yes Movies in the Google Play Store, but I would also recommend people going through a Google search to find Yes Movies. But anyways, so either way, I hope that you can say that you could see R.I.P.D 2, especially if it seems interesting to you. Even though I am to state is like, well, like it may not be as good as the other film, but at least it's something to just kind of connect us to that universe. And there is actually some pretty cool looking CGI here, but again, like there's little tiny connections to the original R.I.P.D movie to this one, and maybe people will just be satisfied by that. So, with that said, I think it's about that time to just double fire this bad boy up and hopefully get into spoilers, because it's about that time to say it is spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about the time I'm getting to spoil this movie. So, we begin this film in Red Creek, Utah, 1876. We have a guy named Otis who is desperately mining for gold, realizing that everyone was to go on and state that there isn't any more gold in this Red Creek mine. And Otis is just like, no, like, I think I can just get a little bit more out of you. So Otis continues to use this pickaxe to open up this mine, and it feels that Otis is going to go on and open something much more than just having the ability to find gold in this mine. Instead, he is going to open up this portal to release this demon that goes into Otis. And we end up having Otis, who gives us these black eyes, and I'm like, what is this, like supernatural? But come to find out, again, like there's some interesting special effects that goes on to this movie, even though sometimes it may feel cheaper than the original film, but still. So we then go on to push on to Horseshoe, Wyoming, 1 month later. So we have Roy Pulsiver that goes on to meet his daughter, who is Charlotte. Charlotte is to go on and be coming off this train, and she is to have this wedding dress that, of course, she is marrying Angus with. And so Roy is just desperate to want to see this wedding dress, and Charlotte's like, oh no, you cheat, like, no, don't go on and see it just yet. And so all of a sudden Angus arrives behind Charlotte, and Roy is not accepting of Angus marrying Charlotte. So we have both Charlotte and Roy who is talking about all this, and like stating that like Roy doesn't believe that Angus can protect Charlotte, and Charlotte is just like, well, like, I need a husband, I don't need a bodyguard. And so Roy is like, well, I understand that. But so we go on, and we end up having a number of these men who all make their way to kind of rob these people or try to kill them. And so Roy goes on to have Charlotte go into this place and tells her, it's like, well, if anybody comes in, you just take this gun and you shoot them. So Roy, of course, who is a sheriff, because he has this badge, goes on to make his way to take these men out. And so we have Roy trying to dispatch these men, and he ends up shooting Zeke in the head. Pow. And so what happens is when Roy is making his way around this train, to try to go on and dispatch these men, we have Roy, who ends up getting shot in the head and killed from behind. Roy then all of a sudden is to make his way up into the sky to then, of course, be sucked into this purgatory, or in this case, is to be R.I.P.D. So, Roy all of a sudden, immediately when he is sitting in this chair, in this table, in the same kind of interrogation room that, of course, we had seen in the original R.I.P.D. movie with Ryan Reynolds, where when he ends up getting like sucked into the R.I.P.D. department, it's very similar visuals to the point of us realizing that this is almost similar. So Roy immediately goes on to find this bucket and he barfs right in the bucket. And we, of course, have Hano that is talking to Roy. It's like, well, I'm sorry, yeah, like everybody has that reaction. And so Roy is talking about that he had seen like the biggest bright light that he have ever seen. And Hano's like, yeah, you and everybody else. So, like, excuse me. Roy is not the only one that has gone on to experience that. So, having Roy state this is just like, yeah, like we've heard this all the time. So, Hano is telling Roy that he is to be here in the Rest in Peace department because, of course, Roy is now dead. So, Roy ends up going on to accept that he is going to be this person who goes and hunts down these deados and is to easily want to go on and be involved in this mission. And so Hano has Roy go to this section where all these weapons are, and we of course have Roy, who has this gun that he named Susie, and he does not want to part with this gun. But Hano ends up telling Roy, it's like, well, hey, like, if you go on and you use like a real gun on these deados, it's basically just a snake bite to them, and it really does nothing. So Hano is telling Roy that it's like, well, if you want a real gun, like, this will get the job done. So Roy not only goes on to keep his Susie, but then is to also have his other gun also to kill off these deados. So Hano ends up going on to explain to Roy about the eclipse that had happened a month earlier, that of course was to be tied to the Otis story, because come to find out, Otis's character, there was a because of the eclipse, I guess there was a weakening in hell for him to go on, or hell or purgatory or wherever he really came from, which I guess in this case, with technically how the character is presented by the end of the film, is to really just be hell. So somehow Otis, because of the eclipse, had gotten to have him break free from hell and be able to make it back here. And so, like, that's kind of what Hano is telling Roy, that a month before, like, there had been a whole thing connecting a number of deados, da-da-da-da-da. So come to find out, there is this unusual symbol that is on the ground about a hungry snake, a snake that is kind of eating itself. And so Hano is to state to Roy that this is a symbol to help people kind of understand what they're up against. So we have Roy that agrees to be in the Rest in Peace department. He is getting like this brand upon his chest, as he is to kind of pull his chest open and see this brand being placed on him. And so Roy ends up going on to be sent into this kind of small department, And Hano ends up explaining to Roy, it's like, well, like, people used to be a lot smaller, but since now people are getting, like, taller, we've just never adjusted this door. So, Hano is telling Roy that, like, what his mission is, and so on and so forth. So, we have Hano that just sends Roy to this outhouse, to this crapper. And so Roy ends up having this door swing open, and he barfs again right into this bucket that is at this outhouse. So Roy goes on to immediately meet with his partner, Jean, who is to kind of be more of this like medieval times character. We also have Roy, who is to change the style of the way of which that he looks, to be kind of what we more see here in this image. So we go on to have Roy, who is talking to Jean, and so Jean is kind of giving Roy the lay of the land of who she is, and that she only fights with a sword instead of a gun. And Roy is like, well, that's stupid. Like, whatever is going to happen if you, like, ever end up in a gunfight. And so, like, Jean is like, well, I'm so good with a sword that I don't need a gun. So it's like, oh, okay, all right. Because Jean goes on and just flings these swords and kills whoever. So, yeah, she definitely doesn't need a sword, or she doesn't need a gun because she just flings swords everywhere. So, and she's really accurate with it. So, Roy goes on, and we end up having Roy, who immediately wants nothing to do with what Jean is wanting to just push him to do. So Roy just runs off to go back to his daughter so he can talk to her. So immediately when Roy runs back to his daughter, Jean is to grab him and is to now have to tell him what is to be similar to what Jeff tells Ryan Reynolds, and is to tell him, like, well, hey, like, you cannot go on and tell your daughter who you really are, because it won't come out correctly. It'll come out as gibberish. And your daughter won't know who you are because you are a different person to her. And Roy is like, what are you talking about? And then so Roy is to go on and see within a reflection or within a mirror that he, of course, is to be a African American woman. And so he's like, okay. So it seems that also Jean is to be a African woman also. So I'm like, wait a minute. So you would think that, like, if we remember the other, like, R.I.P.D, like, we had, like, Jeff Bridges, who was, like, this slamming supermodel, and we had, like, Ryan Reynolds, who was to be this, like, goofy-looking Asian guy. Like, why is it that, like, in the sequel, like, we don't play up the fact that it's, like, okay, like, the original like, person who ends up getting partnered with Roy, wouldn't she have, like, a way better leg up than Roy does because she's been doing this for longer? But she doesn't. Like, she's very even to Roy. But the funny thing is we have Jean that is to also state that Roy is her fourth partner. And Roy is like, well, what are you talking about? Who else is working with you? And Jean is like, well, like, the Son, the Father, and the Holy Ghost. And so Roy is technically her fourth partner. And so Roy is just like, oh, okay, so some goofy metaphorical crap. So we, excuse me. So we have Roy that goes on to see his own grave next to his wife, who is Millie. And so, come to find out, if people are to remember the first R.I.P.D movie, we, of course, have Roy, who mentions that his skull was eaten by coyotes. And so I was like, okay, like, why is his body all buried in this grave? Wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Like, they effed up this continuity. And then they go, whoa, 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 no, 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 we didn't. So Gene ends up stating that there are certain body parts that they buried in Roy's hole, but Gene is to also state that the skull is to be separate from the rest of the body because the skull had been kind of eaten by coyotes. And so it's like, okay, so they kept the continuity, so that's good. So, like, supposedly, like, the body parts were like the shoulder or like the butt. And so, like, Roy is just like, well, like, I never, like, thought I would be standing on my own, like, rear end, I guess. So, standing over my own grave. So, Roy ends up making a joke about, like, certain parts of him that Gene should, like, dig back up and so on and so forth. So, Roy is to mention all the friends that he had when he died, and come to find out Roy has been dead for a number of days, because by the time that Roy gets to the R.I.P.D, he has been kind of dead for 3 days now. So Roy is to go on and find a old friend of his, who is to yeah, this doesn't state here. So we have this old friend who is a preacher. Let's state this. Let me pause here 1 second. Yeah, I couldn't find the character. That's why I was like, oh, okay, yeah, because it's not listed on IMDb or the picture isn't there. So we have this preacher that goes on and is to talk about Roy, and so this guy is going on and saying kind words, even though there's also some points where, like, this guy is to mention how, like, Roy was a pain also. So we go and have this preacher that talks to these two, and then we end up going on to having Roy want to also go after the men that tried to kill him. So Roy ends up tracking down the men that are getting hauled away in the in this horse and buggy. And so Roy is wanting to go after the people that did him wrong, and was to try to outsmart these marshal people by kind of tossing silver on them. So come to find out, Gene is to realize, like, well, hey, we can't go on and do this. Like, there's no real reason for us to go on and try to take down these people. But then Gene all of a sudden realizes that the guys who had possibly gone after Roy are to be deados themselves, because they have this symbol upon their chest. And so Gene is like, well, like, I guess there's a case here for us after all, because these guys have this deado symbol upon their chest. So Gene goes on to try and bribe these U.S. Marshals to come and help her friend who has gone on and been injured. And so by the time that the Marshals go to Roy, Gene and Roy kind of knock all these Marshals out, and then they go on to then question the deados. So what they end up doing is they want the Deados to talk. And so, since none of them are going to talk, we then have Jean, who pours holy water into one of the Deados, and the Deados are to go on and pop the horse and buggy, like, cage that they're inside of, because Roy can't go on and break this lock that's on this cage where these guys are inside of. So one of the Deados pop, and that's where we get like this big, interesting special effect. And we have both Roy and Jean trying to take out this Deado, and so they end up killing off this Deado, and then they go back to question one of the Deados that are left, because they end up killing both of them off, and then they kind of grab this one Deado that they call Slim, and so they question him, and while they go on to question him, Roy is to state that Slim was to possibly be one of them that was to go on and kill Perciver, or Roy Pulsiver. And so Slim was just like maybe I did, maybe didn't, like, I don't know, like, Slim is just to state that he mostly would just steal things, and that was the only like bad thing he's ever gone on and done. So at one point, Jean is tempted to go on and give this guy holy water to make him pop, but she ends up putting a cross to his chest and then kind of pushes back the demon. And so they end up going on to taking Slim and dragging him along via these horses, so that way they can make their way into this town. So we now have Otis, who is talking to a ex-R.I.P.D. Woman who had escaped, as well as Otis. And so Nell is going on and talking to Otis and stating that she, as well as others, are possibly not really believing that Otis is who he says he is. And they also do realize that Otis is to have a weapon to kill them off, because of course he is to have a R.I.P.D. weapon. So we have Otis that is telling Nell that he is definitely going to come up with a way to have them all believe him, and so kind of rest assured. So we have both Roy and Jean and Slim, and they make their way to this hotel that is to be run by Julius Butterfield. And so we have Roy and Jean, who get a room regardless of the color of their other skin, meaning who they are to be disguised as, because Butterfield does not like to go on and have people rent rooms of people of certain skin. And we go on to have Roy and Jean, who are stating that they are bounty hunters, and this is one of their bounties. So we go on to have at one point where Roy and Jean are to figure out that Slim was the one guy who was to have gone on and killed Roy in the past, and Slim is to go on and state that he was not that guy. That, if anything, Butterfield was to make all those wanted signs, and so more than likely Butterfield is to at some point be the real culprit of the guy who had killed and shot Roy, and will have Roy face Butterfield by the end of the film to have him go on and be arrested and put into jail for the rest of his life. But so we go on and have Roy and Jean, who end up taking Slim in. And so Slim, it seems, is wanting to have a change of heart, to start to feel it's like, well, hey, maybe I can go on and like help you guys out and be on your guys' side, and maybe my judgment will go on and get changed. And so both Roy and Jean are just like, no. And like Slim's like, come on, like I want to help you guys. And so we have Roy and we have Jean who leave off. So we have Butterfield that goes to Otis, because Butterfield desperately wants, because people are starting to get sick. Normal human people are all starting to get sick from the Red Creek mine. And so, like, the air is starting to get thin and everyone is starting to get sick, whoever is not already dead. So we have Butterfield, who is desperately asking Otis for him to get this kind of like gas mask over his face, so he can go on and kind of breathe easier. And Otis is like, well, like, the only people I give these masks to are people that I make work in the mine. Like, if you're not going to be one of those people, I shouldn't give you this mask. And so Butterfield ends up taking the mask, and so Otis is like, well, I guess I'm just going to have to make you work in the mine then. So we find out that because we had an assumption as Roy was to hear about Charlotte, who is still alive, there was an assumption that Angus was actually killed during that whole time where Roy was trying to go on and kill all those men. But come to find out, Angus did not die. He was just taken by the men and put in the mines like a lot of these other people. We have a spot where one woman is to have just gotten there, and she's wearing a mask and she's tempted to take it off, and Angus is telling this woman, hey, don't take your mask off, because if you take your mask off, you're going to get very sick and you're going to die like any number of other people have at some point. So Angus even goes on to take off this mask himself, and then this woman can see that Angus is starting to get more and more sick. So it's like, hey, toss on this mask. And so, or keep your mask back on, because you're dying. So we go on to have all these people work in this mine. And so the thing of it is that Otis is to state here that the reasoning for doing this whole thing with this mine is so that way there's going to be that same event again that ends up having the barrier getting weak and having all these more deados end up coming out, so that way they can just jump into a number of people and be able to like possess these people so they can take control of them. So I know there was a whole scene where Otis goes on to kill one of his own workers, because again, one of his workers doesn't go on and believe him, so he kills one of his own workers off to kind of show everyone like his own power, because he goes on and takes one of his own men because they don't believe him, and we have Otis that rips the deado out of the guy and is to force the head of the Deado to open its eyes, so that way Otis can go on and just kind of kill it off and crush it off. And so we have everybody that's like, okay, like this guy like should be as strong as what he's kind of telling us, what he had told us. So we go on to have, of course, Roy and Jean make their way into this mine. And what immediately ends up happening is that both Roy and Jean end up getting imprisoned, and they end up getting put into the cell. So what happens after that is we go on to have Slim be rescued by the girl who was Butterfield's assistant, or kind of woman that was kind of helping Butterfield out in the hotel. She goes on and finds out who the real person was who had gone on to shoot Roy. So Slim is being falsely imprisoned, so this woman frees him and is telling him, like, hey, you need to go on and tell those people who really killed Roy. So Slim runs off to go into the cave where both Roy and Jean are, as both Roy and Jean had gone on to talk to Nell, and it's to state, it's like, well, hey, like, I know who these people exactly are, because of course I was an ex-R.I.P.D. person. And so we have both Otis and we have both Nell who go on to talk to both Roy and Jean. So now we get to find out who Jean is. Because, of course, Jean is having all these kind of weird flashbacks that don't make sense at certain points. And we're like, okay, what does this mean who Jean really is? Come to find out, Jean is actually Joan of Arc. And so Jean is to have a historical character tied to, so it's like, okay, that's kind of cool. Like, it really doesn't, like, say that, like, Jean is going to be this, like, miraculous character and whatever, that all of a sudden, like, since we now know who she is, like, she's going to be, like, super amazing or something. But so we go on to have Otis saying, like, yeah, it's almost time for us to go on and open up like the kind of the barrier or whatever to let all these demons out. So they finally go on, and all these demons are starting to come out and start to possess people. And so Angus is to figure out, as everybody's running around trying to get away from these demons, Angus just figures out that all you need to do is not look at them, and they won't. So it's like the Indiana Jones thing with the Ark of the Covenant, where Indiana Jones and the other girl, like, don't go on and look at any of the monsters, and they don't get killed by them. It's the same kind of thing. So Angus is running around telling everybody, don't look at it, like, it won't take you if you don't look at it. So we then have Otis grabbing guys that he's working with and telling them, like, hey, go and force them to look so we can possess them all. So we finally go on to have Slim that goes on and rescues both Roy and Jean. And before he does, we have Slim who's stating, like, okay, like, my judgment is going to get reversed now, isn't it? And they're like, sure, whatever you want. Like, yeah, like, it seems that you're going to help us now, so sure. Because Slim had gone on to, like, stab into the guards and kill them off. So Slim goes on and rescues and saves both Roy and Jean. So now, of course, we have Roy and Jean who need to go on and start shooting some of the lesser deadoed characters, but then at some point are to go on and face off against Otis, because that's the big thing. So we have Otis who goes on to stop being like his normal like human self, and then he changes to what he actually really is, which is actually Astaroth. That is to supposedly have now Jean go on like, oh my god, like this guy is to be like the right hand of God, or the right hand of the devil. I mean, the right hand of the devil. So Jean and both Roy here are to realize that they have like they have their what's the right word? They have this not going really against them, because this is a much more powerful person. So we have Jean that has to get back to her sword, because she had kind of put it into the ground, because what Jean tried to do is she ended up using uh, these things called the tears as this necklace weapon to drop into this hole, which brought all these demons back to where they came from. And so like these tears is like this big weapon that you can kind of put it into your own gun and fire these tears. Like it's to kind of take down all of these deados. And like holy water before was the one thing to get the demons to pop before. So now we have these tears that are kind of used as a weapon also here. So we have Astaroth after we have both Roy and Jean who are holding onto this sword, and all the demons are going back into the hole. We now just have Roy, Jean, and Astaroth, because everyone else is to be all the other demons are put back in the hole, and they thought like, oh, did we get a Otis also? And come to find out, no, because he just appears and he ends up fighting against them. So we have them trying as much as possible to take down Astaroth, and Roy ends up finding this shotgun that he's like, all right, like I have one thing to use against this thing. So Roy goes on to get this shotgun and start shooting against Astaroth, while Jean goes back for her sword. So Roy starts shooting into this thing, and is to realize that Astaroth is using its other demons that are kind of attached to its body as this kind of defense mechanism. And we go on to have Jean, who gets her sword and is trying to fight all these demons off. And so we have both of them trying to fight off Astaroth, and it's not working very well. So finally, Roy goes on and is to have him become more powerful by Roy putting the tears into a shotgun and firing this round that is to go on and not only take every single demon that is attached to Astaroth, but also Astaroth himself. And then finally is to take down this entity. And so now after that, now that everything is settled, we also had this moment where Angus was talking to Roy and was having this bizarre moment where Roy was trying to state to Angus, it's like, well, hey, like, I realize now that you're a much stronger person than I thought you were, kind of thing. And Angus is like, what are you talking about? Like, I've never met you before. And Roy then goes on and is to state, like, well, like, like I meant from like the people who knew you, like that said your name before, and all this and that, because of course we have Maple that has never met Angus, but like because of course we can't really state that Maple is Roy, because Roy can't state that because it'll just come off as gibberish. So Mabel is also telling Angus that like about Charlotte, and about like if Angus was to have actually been able to talk to Roy now, like what would Angus say? And Angus starts to go on and is to start to say that Roy is a very handsome man, because Roy tells him to state that, because it's like, yeah, you got to open up with a compliment. And so, like, all this goofy crap. So we go on to finally, after Roy has talked to Angus and like really is to cement that it's like this guy has the blessing to marry Charlotte, even though there's not much that Roy can state here that doesn't come off as gibberish. So we turn around and then have both Roy and Jean, who go back to the hotel, and they end up finding out the truth that Butterfield was the one to have killed Roy, because Butterfield ends up telling that Butterfield had killed Roy by accident, because Butterfield was thinking that Roy was one of these gang members, because one of the gang members were looking for him and he didn't want to go back to them. So he was to shoot somebody, and that accidentally was Roy. And so Butterfield ended up going back with those guys anyways. And so yeah, so we end up having Roy, who is to ask, since this town doesn't have a sheriff, like who is going to be now the new sheriff. And so the girl who was assisting Butterfield is to state, like, well, here's the thing. Like, we're just going to go on and make Slim, we're just going to make him the new sheriff, and I'm going to be his deputy. And so it's like, oh, okay, all right, that works out. So we then go on and have both Roy and Jean go into seeing Charlotte and Angus getting married, but like we only see like the tail end of it, where they're kind of making their way out of the church. And so Charlotte and Jean go on, or Charlotte and Angus go on to meet up with the two women that end up being Roy and Jean. And Roy tries to say something very heartfelt, but then it's coming gargled. And so Jean has to state what Roy was trying to say. And so we have Roy that ends up hugging Charlotte and hugging Angus, and then they end up walking off. And Charlotte ends up saying to Angus, it's like, it feels like I've known that woman for my whole entire life. And Angus is like, yeah, there's something otherworldly about those people. And so, excuse me, we end up having both Roy and Jean kind of walking off. And so Roy bizarrely is stating that I guess he's going to go to heaven now. And because Roy, of course, is to think that when he was to die, he was going to meet up with Millie and spend an eternity together. And Jean is telling Roy, it's like, well, unless like Millie is already kind of like with someone else already. And Roy is like, wait a minute, like people in heaven can go on and do that. And Jean's like, well, yeah, like she might have moved on already and been with someone else. So Roy is going on and like thinking that he's going to heaven now. And Jean is like, you do know that you signed a contract for you to be with R.I.P.D for 100 years, right? And Roy is like, no, and Gene is like, yeah. So come to find out, Roy is realizing that he's going to be involved in the RIPD for a very long time. And so we have both Gene and we have both Roy that go into the porta potty and end up kind of wrapping up this film. So, with that said, I'm going to go on and get out of here. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about RIPD 2 Rise of the Damned. So, with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Let me know if there's anything that I forgot about, because I'm sure that there's a tweed bit of details or whatever that I kind of forgot about this movie. Even though I just kind of recently saw it, who knows? But with that said, goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.